There's a version of BTS that never happened. 7 teenagers who quietly packed their bags, left their families, and moved into a cramped company dorm in Seoul, not knowing if any of it would work. No guarantees, no backup plans, just a bet they made on themselves at an age when most people are still figuring out what they want for lunch. We know the part that came after, the sold-out stadiums, the Billboard records, the United Nations speech. But that's the part the story usually skips to. What actually got them there? Because between the debut and the dynasty, there's a stretch of years that doesn't get talked about enough. A stretch that cost each of them something real. Not the romantic kind of sacrifice you see in movies, the actual kind. The kind that leaves a mark. So here's the honest version. 7 members, 7 things they gave up that most people their age never had to think about. Some of it will reframe everything you thought you knew about how this group got built. Let's start from the bottom. Number 7, the childhood he never got to finish. Jungkook. Jungkook was born on September 1, 1997 in Busan, South Korea, the youngest of 2 brothers in a working-class family. By the time he was 13 years old, he had already made a decision that most adults would hesitate to make. He left everything familiar, packed up, and moved alone to Seoul to chase something he couldn't yet fully name. That kind of move doesn't happen in a vacuum. It has weight. And understanding what it actually cost him requires going back to the moment it started. Because the story of Jungkook's sacrifice isn't a dramatic single event. It's a slow, steady giving away of the years most people take completely for granted. In 2011, at the age of 13, Jungkook auditioned for Superstar K, one of South Korea's most watched televised audition competitions. He didn't make it through. But what happened next changed everything. He was noticed by multiple talent scouts in the audience and received offers from no fewer than 7 entertainment agencies, including some of the biggest names in the Korean music industry. At 13, being courted by 7 different companies isn't normal. Most kids that age are navigating middle school friendships and homework. Jungkook was fielding recruitment calls from industry professionals who recognized something in him before he'd had time to fully recognize it in himself. Among those companies was JYP Entertainment, at the time one of the most powerful labels in K-pop, home to established acts and a proven training infrastructure. Signing with JYP would have meant prestige, stability, and the credibility that came with a well-known name behind you. It was, by almost any industry calculation, the safer and smarter bet. Jungkook turned it down. He chose Big Hit Entertainment, a company so small and financially strained at the time that it barely registered on most people's radars. The reason, by his own account and that of his members, was a single conversation with Namjoon, who would later become RM, BTS's leader. Namjoon was already a trainee at Big Hit and had earned a reputation as a gifted lyricist and rapper. Jungkook saw something in him, a conviction, a seriousness of purpose that made him trust the direction. A 13-year-old chose an underdog company over an industry giant because of one person's authenticity. That says something. And it also set the clock on everything he'd have to give up from that point forward. Shortly after signing with Big Hit, Jungkook moved to Seoul and began training. He enrolled at Seoul Performing Arts High School, a performing arts institution that counted other future K-pop artists among its students. But the reality of that period was far from glamorous. Training days at Big Hit were long and physically demanding. Hours of vocal work, choreography sessions, and for Jungkook, the added challenge of being the youngest person in the room trying to keep pace with older trainees who had more years and more experience. He had no prior formal training in dance or singing before joining Big Hit. Unlike some of his future bandmates, he arrived with raw ability and the willingness to work until he caught up. And that willingness came at a cost, because the catching up process consumed the exact years when his peers back in Busan were going to school, forming friendships that would last decades, going through the ordinary social experiences of adolescence. First relationships, school festivals, late-night convenience store runs with friends who'd known them since childhood. Jungkook was doing none of that. He was in a practice room. What often gets glossed over in Jungkook's story is the sheer emotional reality of being a child in that environment. He was the youngest member of a group whose other members ranged from 2 to 4 years older than him. That gap, at 13 to 15, is not a small one developmentally. The Hyungs, the older members, became his primary social world, his family away from family. He has spoken in various interviews and in BTS's own documentary content about how formative that dynamic was, how the members became his reference point for growing up, how he looked to them to understand how to carry himself, how to handle pressure, how to be. It's a strange thing to think about, learning how to become an adult while simultaneously trying not to fall behind in a professional environment that had zero patience for immaturity. His actual family was back in Busan. His parents, his older brother, people he had grown up with and relied on, were now a city and a long train ride away. He has mentioned in interviews that he cried often during those early years, quietly, in the way the teenagers who are determined not to show weakness often do. The homesickness was real, the loneliness was real, but so was the commitment, and he never wavered from it. By the time BTS debuted on June 13, 2013, Jungkook was 15 years old. 15. He stepped onto the stage at Uijeongbu Art Center as the youngest member of a 7-piece group on a label that most of the industry expected to fail within a year or two. He hadn't finished high school yet. He hadn't had a conventional adolescence. He hadn't experienced the kinds of rites of passage that most of his generation were moving through at exactly that age. What he had instead was a debut stage, a group of brothers forged under pressure, and a decision made at 13 that had already cost him years of ordinary life. The thing about giving up your childhood is that you don't fully understand what you've given up until long after you've done it. Jungkook has acknowledged in later years, in Burn the Stage, in Break the Silence, and in interviews across various points of BTS's career, that there are parts of growing up he simply didn't get to experience in the way most people do. He grew up inside BTS. The group was his school, his social circle, his family structure, his entire context for becoming a person. That's not something any achievement, any record, any sold-out stadium can retroactively give back. And here's what makes this point land differently when you sit with it. Jungkook has never framed it as a tragedy. He's been consistent in saying that the path he chose was the one he wanted. But wanting something and not grieving what it cost you are two different things. The boy who turned down 7 agencies at 13 and moved alone to a city he didn't know to train under a company nobody believed in understood something early that most people spend years trying to learn. That real commitment has a price, and you pay it before you know what the return looks like. And if that's what number 7 looks like, wait until you hear what the members ahead of him actually walked away from. Number 6. The actor who chose a different stage, Jin. Kim Sok-jin was born on December 4, 1992, in Gwacheon, Gyeonggi Province, South Korea, the second son in a family that was, by most accounts, financially comfortable relative to many of his future bandmates. That context matters, because Jin's sacrifice wasn't economic in the way some of the others were. His sacrifice was directional. He was already heading somewhere specific when someone stopped him on the street and redirected the entire trajectory of his life. In 2011, a staff member from Big Hit Entertainment spotted a young man in a school uniform near the entrance of Konkuk University in Seoul and asked him to audition for the company. The young man was Kim Sok-jin. He wasn't auditioning for anything. He wasn't looking for an opportunity. He was simply moving through his day when a stranger told him he had something worth developing. His initial response was to decline. Jin has spoken about this in interviews. He was skeptical, uncertain, and not particularly drawn to the idea of idol training. He had no background in singing. He had no background in dancing. What he did have was a clear path already forming in front of him. He had been accepted into the arting department at Jungkook University, one of South Korea's well-regarded institutions, and he was on a trajectory toward a performance career rooted in acting and film, a lane with its own prestige, its own timeline, and its own definition of success. Choosing Big Hit meant stepping off that path completely and stepping onto one with no guaranteed destination. He auditioned, was accepted as a trainee, and from that point forward, the acting career he had been building toward was set aside. Not canceled, set aside. But in an industry with the speed and saturation of K-pop, aside quickly becomes behind, and behind quickly becomes gone. What followed was arguably the steepest learning curve of any BTS member in the pre-debut period. Every other member who joined Big Hit brought some form of relevant prior training. Namjoon came as an established underground rapper. Yoongi had years of music production experience. Hosek with already a trained and highly skilled dancer. The younger members had varying degrees of performing arts school experience. Jin walked in with none of that. His training had to cover ground that his teammates had already crossed before they ever arrived. Dancing from scratch, vocal training from zero, stage presence without the accumulated hours of performance that give it shape. He has acknowledged in multiple documented interviews and in BTS's behind-the-scenes content that he was acutely aware of the gap. He knew he was behind. He knew the others had foundations he was still trying to pour, and he worked, consistently, stubbornly, to close the distance. What's worth understanding here is what Jin walked away from in doing so. Acting in South Korea, particularly for someone with his visual presence and his acceptance into a competitive university program, was a realistic and viable path. The Korean film and television industry is one of the most vibrant in the world, a fact that was already becoming internationally apparent in the early 2010s and has since been confirmed beyond any reasonable argument. Jin had the looks, the acceptance, and the institutional pathway already in motion. He traded that for a trainee contract at a small, financially uncertain company, no guarantee of debut, and a skill set he would have to build from nothing while surrounded by people who already had theirs. During the trainee years, Big Hit was not a stable environment. The company was dealing with financial difficulties serious enough that its survival was genuinely in question. Jin has mentioned in retrospective interviews that the uncertainty of those years was real, that debut was never guaranteed, that the company's situation added a layer of anxiety to an already demanding training schedule. He was preparing for a debut that might never happen, in a field he hadn't trained for, having left behind a field he had. That's a specific kind of pressure that doesn't get discussed enough in the context of his story. He continued his formal education in parallel, enrolling at Global Cyber University in the Broadcast and Entertainment program, managing online coursework alongside a training and eventually a promotional schedule that would exhaust most people half his age. He later pursued graduate-level studies as well. That commitment to education while simultaneously managing a full-time career as a global pop star is often cited as a fun fact. It's actually evidence of a person who refused to let one choice erase every other dimension of who he was. When BTS debuted on June 13, 2013, Jin was 20 years old by international age, the oldest member of the group. The industry pressure around that is not trivial. In K-pop, age has historically carried an inverse relationship with commercial viability, particularly in the early years of an act's career. Being the oldest meant that the window for building a career was, by conventional industry logic, shorter. He was already at an age where some acts in the idol industry were considering retirement strategies, and he was just beginning. The years that followed debut brought their own particular weight for Jin. BTS's early career was defined by hip-hop and rap-heavy music, a direction that naturally centered Namjoon, Yoongi, and Hosek. As a vocalist without the underground credibility of the rap line or the prodigious technical ability of Jimin or Jungkook from a young age, Jin had to carve out space for himself in a group identity that wasn't initially built around the kind of performer he was. He did it through consistency, through humor that became one of the group's most beloved qualities, and through a vocal development arc that, by the time BTS reached their commercial peak, produced some of the group's most emotionally resonant moments, including Epiphany, a solo track he performed in full at BTS concerts that regularly drew some of the most intense audience responses of any piece in their live setlist. None of that came from natural baseline advantage. It came from a person who chose to build something from scratch, in a field he wasn't trained for, next to people who were, and who refused to let that gap define his ceiling. He enlisted for mandatory South Korean military service in December 2022 at the Yuncheon Army Training Center, the first BTS member to do so, and was honorably discharged in June 2024. The entire arc of his career, from the sidewalk outside Konkuk University to the military discharge that preceded a new chapter, is the story of a man who gave up a safe path for an uncertain one and spent over a decade proving that the uncertainty was worth choosing. And the thing is, what Jin gave up was a future he could already see. What comes next is the story of someone who gave up a future that most people would have fought to protect.
Number 5. The secret he carried in his shoulder, Suga. Min Yoongi was born in Daegu, South Korea on March 9, 1993, in a household where economic stability was a constant concern, and pursuing a creative career was viewed as a direct path to financial ruin. His interest in music began early, but his parents, who had lived through economic hardships, actively opposed his ambitions, to the point of discarding his music sheets and lyrics, forcing him to write in secret under his desk. This lack of parental validation created a deep emotional rift, forcing him to navigate his formative teenage years with an isolation he channeled entirely into his music. In his hometown of Daegu, he operated as an underground producer and rapper under the moniker Gloss, earning next to nothing. He produced tracks for local crews, selling beats for a pittance, and frequently not getting paid at all by predatory promoters. This financial instability wore down his health, leading to undernourishment and stress about survival, frequently facing choices that defined his daily survival, such as choosing between spending 1,000 won on a basic bowl of black bean noodles or using that same 1,000 won to catch a bus home in the freezing cold. By 2010, he had won second place in a rap competition hosted by Big Hit Entertainment, which secured him a spot as a trainee in Seoul. He moved to the capital with nothing but a bag of clothes and his music equipment. But the reality of Seoul did not match the promise of a fresh start. Big Hit was a small, struggling company on the brink of bankruptcy, meaning the trainees had to share a tiny, cramped dorm room where mold grew on the walls and space was so limited that they slept side by side on the floor. To support himself, cover his living expenses, and pay for his university tuition, he had to take on part-time delivery jobs during the early morning hours, long before the sun rose and before his grueling trainee schedule began. In 2012, while working one of these shifts as a motorcycle delivery boy in the rain, a car struck him at an intersection, throwing him off the bike and leaving him lying on the wet asphalt. Fear of the consequences outweighed the pain. He worried about the damaged delivery bike and losing his job rather than his skeleton. When he stood up, he realized something was severely wrong with his left shoulder, but he chose not to go to the hospital immediately because he could not afford the medical bills. The medical reality was grim. He had dislocated his shoulder and torn the labrum, the ring of cartilage that keeps the arm bones secure within the shoulder socket. In the highly competitive world of K-pop, physical injury was often an automatic grounds of dismissal from a training program, as companies did not want to invest limited resources in a trainee who could not dance. Terrified that he would be cut from the group and sent back to Daegu as a failure, he hid the injury from Big Hit staff and his fellow bandmates, telling them he had simply fallen down the stairs when they noticed him wincing or holding his arm. This lie was born out of a survival instinct honed by years of financial instability.
Where showing any sign of vulnerability was equivalent to admitting defeat, he knew that the agency was operating on a tight budget and that any delay in their debut plans could sink the entire company, meaning the stakes were not just his career, but the futures of the other 6 trainees who relied on him. For months, he pushed through intense, high-impact choreography practices that lasted up to 12 hours a day, executing acrobatic moves and sharp synchronized routines while his shoulder joint was structurally compromised and constantly slipping out of place. The physical agony of dancing with a torn labrum is difficult to overstate, yet he endured it in silence, masking the pain with over-the-counter painkillers and wrapping his shoulder tightly under his shirts. When the physical strain became too obvious to hide, he finally confessed the truth to Big Hit management, expecting to be packed off home. Instead, the agency's founder, Bang Si-hyuk, decided to pay for his tuition and medical care so he could stop working part-time jobs and focus entirely on recovery and training. However, the damage to his shoulder was already chronic, and when BTS debuted in June 2013, he stepped onto the stage carrying a physical liability that would plague him for nearly a decade. As the group's global popularity exploded, the choreographies became increasingly complex and physically demanding, requiring him to perform jumps, floor work, and rapid arm movements in songs like Fire and Dionysus that exacerbated the injury. For 8 years, he managed the condition behind closed doors, undergoing regular physical therapy, receiving cortisone injections directly into the joint to numb the pain before major concert tours, and wearing specialized athletic tape to keep the shoulder from dislocating mid-performance. During world tours, while fans saw a confident, sharp-tongued rapper commanding the stage, the reality backstage was a cycle of ice packs, physical therapists, and silent endurance. The situation reached a breaking point in 2020 during the recording of the music video for Black Swan, when he found he could not raise his left arm above a certain angle without experiencing sharp, shooting pain. A medical examination revealed that the damage had progressed to a point where his shoulder joint was actively decaying, and simple daily tasks like lifting a cup of water or holding a microphone were becoming nearly impossible. In November 2020, he made the difficult decision to undergo posterior labral tear surgery, a procedure that required him to step away from all BTS promotions for several months, including the release of their album BE. His absence was felt deeply by the group and the fandom, symbolized by a blank space on stage during live performances of Life Goes On, where he was eventually represented by a digital hologram. The recovery process was slow and frustrating, requiring months of painful rehabilitation to regain his range of motion and rebuild the muscle that had atrophied. Through it all, he remained remarkably pragmatic about the ordeal, refusing to frame his long-standing injury as a tragic story, but rather as a practical challenge he had to overcome to keep doing what he loved. The sacrifice of his physical health was the literal price he paid to keep his place in a group that was still trying to find its footing, a silent compromise that shaped his perspective on success and survival. He sacrificed the comfort of a functioning body during his 20s, pushing himself past the limits of human endurance because the alternative was giving up on the one thing that gave his life direction. It is a stark reminder of the hidden physical toll behind the polished, synchronized routines that define global pop music, showing that the road to the top is often paved with silent, agonizing endurance. And yet, while he carried that physical burden in secret, another member was quietly dismantling his own sense of identity just to fit into a mold he never asked for.
Number 4. The persona he had to wear. J-Hope. Jung Ho-suk was born on February 18, 1994 in Gwangju, South Korea, into a family where education was highly prioritized, as his father was a high school literature teacher who expected his son to follow a traditional academic path. Ho-suk, however, was drawn to movement, discovering a passion for dance that clashed directly with his father's values. The domestic tension was significant. His father refused to support his dance classes, viewing it as a dead-end pursuit that would yield no future. It was his mother who stepped in, taking on extra employment, including working abroad, to earn the money required to pay for his training at a local dance academy. This sacrifice by his mother placed a heavy emotional weight on Ho-suk's shoulders from a young age. He knew that his dancing was being funded by her grueling labor, and this awareness transformed his passion into a debt he was determined to repay. In Gwangju, he worked tirelessly, joining the street dance crew Neuron and performing under the name Smile Hoya. He became a respected figure in the local underground dance scene, winning national dance battles and earning a reputation for his freestyle ability and technical precision. He spent his early teenage years performing in underground dance battles, practicing in unventilated basement studios, and mastering the complex street styles of popping and locking. Neuron was not just a hobbyist group, it was a tight-knit community of dedicated dancers who spent hours dissecting rhythm and movement, giving Ho-suk a foundation respected across the city. This made him a localized celebrity in Gwangju, a status that brought a sense of self-made pride. By the time he was scouted by Big Hit Entertainment in 2010, dance was not just his hobby, it was his entire identity, the area where he felt absolute confidence and command. But moving to Seoul to join the company required him to dismantle that identity. Big Hit's vision for their upcoming group was heavily rooted in hip-hop, which meant that Ho-suk could not simply be a dancer, he had to become a rapper. He had no prior training in rap, no background in writing lyrics, and no experience with the vocal styling required for hip-hop delivery. He was placed in training rooms alongside Min Yoongi and Kim Namjoon, two artists who had spent years honing their craft in underground rap battles, and who possessed a deep understanding of rhythm, rhyme schemes, and hip-hop culture. Sitting in those sessions, Ho-suk felt completely out of place, a street dancer trying to speak a language he did not know. The frustration of starting from zero in a discipline he had never anticipated pursuing was immense. He spent hours writing and discarding lyrics, forcing his voice to adopt tones and cadences that felt foreign to him, all while knowing that his position in the group depended on his ability to match the caliber of the established rappers around him. At the same time, he took on the responsibility of dance leader for the trainees. Many of the members, including Jin and Namjoon, had no formal dance training and struggled with basic synchronization. Ho-suk had to translate his intuitive understanding of movement into a teaching method, spending late nights in the practice rooms drilling basic steps with his teammates. This role required him to be patient but demanding, balancing his desire to support his friends with the commercial necessity of meeting the agency's performance standards. The pressure of balancing his own difficult transition into rapping with the task of raising the group's dance ability to a professional level began to erode his resolve. Big Hit conducted weekly and monthly evaluations where trainees were judged individually and collectively. Ho-suk's performance was closely monitored, not just for his own execution, but for how well the rest of the group performed. When other trainees fell behind or failed to sync their movements, the instructors placed the blame on Ho-suk's leadership, creating an environment of constant scrutiny. This forced him to sacrifice his own progress, to spend hours refining the basic mechanics of movement for his team.
The culmination of this stress occurred in the pre-debut period when Hoseok decided he could no longer handle the uncertainty and the pressure, choosing to leave Big Hit and return to Gwangju. The reaction of the other members to his departure illustrates how vital he had become to the group's emotional structure.
Jungkook, the youngest member, wept and pleaded with Hoseok not to leave, while Namjoon went directly to the company's executives and stated clearly that BTS could not debut or succeed without Hoseok. Namjoon argued that Hoseok was the central pillar of their performance and the glue that held their daily dynamics together. Realizing the depth of the members' belief in him, Hoseok reversed his decision and returned to the dorms, choosing to face the uncertainty alongside his bandmates rather than return to a conventional life in Gwangju. Upon his return, the process of identity reconstruction went even further with the creation of his stage name, J-Hope. Inspired by the myth of Pandora's box, the name was designed to position him as the group's source of hope and positive energy. While the persona allowed him to connect deeply with audiences, it also demanded a constant projection of joy, enthusiasm, and brightness, regardless of his actual emotional state. Jung Hoseok, the individual, is described by his members as quiet, serious, highly organized, and naturally introverted. The contrast between his actual personality and the explosive, hyper-positive persona of J-Hope required a continuous psychological effort. He had to learn to mask his fatigue, his anxieties, and his frustrations behind a bright smile, sacrificing his right to project anything other than optimism to the public. This forced positivity was not just a marketing tactic. It became a personal standard he felt obligated to maintain for the sake of the group's brand and the morale of the fans. Over the years, this pressure took a physical and mental toll. During the production of their albums, particularly when preparing for major comebacks, Hoseok worked long hours as both a producer and the choreographer, overseeing the physical execution of their live performances. In documentaries like Burn the Stage, the viewer sees glimpses of the exhaustion behind the scenes, where the energetic persona drops, revealing a quiet, drained young man sitting in dressing rooms with his head in his hands. The sacrifice was not just the physical labor of dance or the intellectual work of learning to rap. It was the relinquishment of his private self in service of a public avatar. He gave up the street dance style that had defined his youth, replaced his organic musical interests with a genre he had to learn under duress, and committed to a persona of relentless optimism that left little room for his natural introversion. Through it all, his mother's early sacrifices remained a driving force, a debt he finally acknowledged publicly in his solo track, Mama, on the 2016 album Wings, where he thanked her for supporting his dream when his father would not. The transformation of Jung Hoseok into J-Hope is a study in the deliberate shaping of a human being to fit the needs of a collective goal. A process that yielded global success but cost him the simplicity of his original identity. He rebuilt himself from the ground up, proving that adaptability is a form of strength, even when it requires you to lock away your own vulnerability. And yet, while he restructured his entire personality to become the group's anchor, another member was facing a different kind of erasure, forced to hide his very existence from the world until the last possible moment. Number 3. The price of absolute invisibility. V. Kim Taehyung was born on December 30, 1995, in Daegu, South Korea, and spent much of his childhood being raised by his grandparents in the rural county of Gocheong. His family worked in agriculture, and Taehyung grew up believing his life path would naturally lead him to become a farmer, working the fields alongside his relatives. Taehyung spent the first 17 years of his life in Gocheong, a mountainous district where agricultural communities are tightly knit. His parents were working long hours to secure the family's finances, which led to Taehyung spending most of his childhood in the care of his grandmother, whom he regarded as a primary parent and stable source of comfort. Growing up in this environment, his conception of success was modest, bound to the rhythms of seasonal planting and harvest. The saxophone, which he picked up at the suggestion of his father, was his first ticket out of this localized reality, teaching him the strict disciplines of breath control, embouchure, and reading sheet music under the guidance of local school band instructors. In 2011, he accompanied a friend to a big hit entertainment audition in Daegu, not intending to participate himself. He was simply there to offer moral support, but a rookie development scout noticed him in the hallway and urged him to audition. After obtaining permission from his parents via a phone call, Taehyung auditioned on the spot, performing a dance, singing, and demonstrating his saxophone skills. He was the only applicant from the Daegu auditions to pass that day, an unexpected turn of events that saw him pack his bags and move to the trainee dorms in Seoul. However, once he arrived at the company, the management made a tactical decision that would subject him to a unique form of psychological isolation. They designated Kim Taehyung as the group's hidden member. The strategy, conceived by the agency's executive team, was intended to keep Taehyung as a secret weapon, protecting him from being poached by larger agencies and creating a sudden impact when the final lineup was revealed just before debut. But what functioned as a calculated marketing strategy on paper was an emotionally painful reality for a teenage boy living in the dorms. From 2011 until June 2013, Taehyung lived, ate, trained, and slept alongside the other 6 members, but to the outside world, he did not exist. During the pre-debut commotional phase, Big Hit began releasing teaser materials, video logs, and social media updates to build an organic fan base. The other 6 trainees regularly recorded video diaries, sat for photo shoots, and interacted with fans online, establishing their public identities. Taehyung was strictly forbidden from appearing in any of these materials. In the dorms, the physical isolation was mirrored by the technical setup of their promotional content. The agency had set up a small studio space inside their one-room apartment, where members would sit in front of a webcam to log their thoughts. Taehyung had to leave the room or sit quietly on the floor below the camera's sightline, holding his breath to avoid making noise that would ruin the audio track. The other trainees, conscious of the strategy but unable to change it, tried to keep his spirits up, but the institutional enforcement of his invisibility meant that he could not join them in group photos or even sign his name to the early logs. He was a phantom trainee, executing every difficult choreography iteration but erased from the developmental history of the group. When the cameras were turned on in the cramped dorm room to record the group's daily diaries, Taehyung had to step out of the frame. He has since recounted the profound loneliness of this period, describing how he would stand in the corner of the room, sometimes next to the trash can, silently watching his friends speak to the camera and connect with a growing community that knew nothing of his presence.
He wanted so desperately to participate, to say hello to the fans, but the rules of the company demanded absolute invisibility. To cope with this exclusion, he recorded his own video logs in private, sitting alone in front of a camera and speaking about his day, his hopes, and his training progress. He did this knowing that these videos would not be uploaded and instead be stored away on a company hard drive, never to see the light of day before the group's debut. The psychological toll of this enforced secrecy was substantial. Taehyung began harboring deep anxieties about his position in the group, constantly worrying that he was kept hidden because the agency was planning to cut him from the lineup at the last minute. Every time a new evaluation approached, or when the members discussed their future debut, the fear that he would be sent back to Gochang without ever being introduced to the public loomed over him.
He had sacrificed his childhood, his saxophone studies, and his rural stability to move to Seoul, yet he was denied the basic recognition of being a member of the group he was working to build. His connection to his grandmother remained a core part of his motivation during these invisible years. He worked with the sole focus of showing her his debut on television, a milestone that represented his transition from a farm boy to a professional performer. The fear that he would fail before she could see the fruits of his training was a constant source of stress, driving him to practice his vocal routines late into the night when the studios were empty. Even his family and friends back home could not see proof of his hard work. While the families of the other members could watch their son's progress online, Taehyung's family had to wait in silence, relying solely on his word that he was indeed training to become an idol. The isolation ended abruptly on June 2, 2013, when Big Hit finally released his teaser photo, officially revealing him as the seventh member of BTS just 11 days before their debut stage. The reaction from the public was a mix of confusion and immediate curiosity. But for Taehyung, the transition from complete invisibility to sudden public scrutiny was jarring. He had to quickly adapt to the reality of being a public figure, managing the pressure of performance while carrying the residual emotional wounds of his long exclusion. The experience left a lasting imprint on his early years in the group, making him hyper-aware of inclusion and creating a deep-seated desire to ensure that no one else felt left out or unseen. The boy from Gochang, who had once expected to spend his life farming, had survived 2 years of forced anonymity, proving that his value was worth keeping secret, even if the cost of that secret was paid in his own isolation. It remains one of the most unusual pre-debut sacrifices in modern K-pop history, a testament to a young artist's endurance under the weight of complete public erasure. Yet while Taehyung fought the silent battle of being invisible, another member was engaged in a relentless physical war against his own body, pushing himself to dangerous extremes just to prove he belonged on the stage at all.
Number 2, the boy who refused to sleep, Jimin. Park Jimin was born on October 13, 1995 in Busan, South Korea, where he early on demonstrated a remarkable talent for movement and physical expression. He enrolled in the Busan High School of Arts, where he majored in modern dance and quickly rose to the top of his class, earning recognition from his instructors as a prodigy in contemporary dance techniques. His teachers and peers expected him to pursue a classical dance career, a path that offered academic prestige and potential entry into elite international dance companies. Jimin's father initially wanted him to pursue a career in science or law, believing that these paths offered a more stable future. When Jimin showed interest in dance, his father agreed to let him try, but expected it to remain a hobby. However, Jimin's commitment was absolute. He spent hours in his room stretching, practicing basic postures, and studying videos of professional dancers. By the time he entered high school, he had not only caught up to students who had trained for years, but had surpassed them, winning the top spot in the entrance examinations and receiving a full scholarship. His decision to throw away this hard-won security for an unestablished agency in Seoul was a massive gamble that created a deep sense of responsibility to succeed, as he felt he could not afford to justify the doubts of those who had advised him to stay in Busan. When Jimin decided to audition for Big Hit Entertainment in 2012 and move to Seoul, his decision was met with strong resistance from his modern dance teachers, who viewed the transition to commercial pop music as a waste of his classical training. Undeterred, he passed the audition and moved to the capital, becoming the final member to join the trainee lineup. However, his late entry meant he had less than a year to prepare for the group's debut, placing him at a severe disadvantage compared to the other trainees who had been working together for years. The physical transition was immediate and punishing. Modern dance requires fluid, expressive, and sweeping movements that utilize different muscle groups than the sharp, locked, and aggressive hip-hop choreography that defined BTS's early concept. Jimin had to actively unlearn years of muscle memory, forcing his body to adapt to a style of movement that felt entirely unnatural to his training. Because of this steep learning curve, the agency's management remained highly skeptical about his suitability for the final group. Jimin has since revealed that his position in BTS was insecure throughout his entire trainee period, with executives threatening to cut him from the lineup almost every week. He was nearly eliminated from the debut team 8 times, a constant psychological threat that created an intense, near-manic drive to prove his worth. To compensate for his perceived lack of skill and the short timeline before debut, he subjected his body to extreme physical exertion. He established a routine where he slept for only 2 to 3 hours a night, spending the remaining hours in the practice studio. He would dance until 4 in the morning, sleep briefly on a plastic mat on the studio floor, and wake up at 6 to attend school and begin another day of training. This level of sleep deprivation and physical exertion would have caused most people to collapse, yet Jimin maintained it for months, driven by the terror of being sent back to Busan as a failure. The daily reality of his life at the company was defined by a small, shared training facility in the Nonyeon-dong neighborhood, where the air was thick with the sweat of dozens of hopeful trainees. The evaluations were held in a small, mirrored basement room before a panel of critical company directors. Because he was the newest addition, Jimin was constantly scrutinized. The agency directors openly questioned his vocal tone, pointing out that his high-pitched register was difficult to blend with the group's hip-hop sound. To address this, he began practicing vocal exercises in the hallways and rest areas between dance sessions, constantly straining his vocal cords to develop the stamina and stability required for live performances. This relentless self-correction was a lonely process, conducted in the small hours of the night when the rest of the city was asleep, creating a pattern of solitary struggle that would define his early career. Even after the group's successful debut in 2013, the pressure to conform to strict industry standards did not ease, leading him to make even more dangerous sacrifices regarding his physical health. During the preparations for the group's 2016 album, Wings, particularly for the promotion of the title track, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Jimin became deeply self-conscious about his appearance. He felt that his face and body looked too soft and lacked the sharp, chiseled aesthetic expected of a top-tier idol. In response, he initiated an extreme dietary regimen that shocked his members and threatened his physical safety. He restricted his food intake to a degree that was medically hazardous, eating only 1 meal every 10 days for a sustained period, while continuing to participate in the group's grueling, high-impact dance rehearsals. The physical consequences of this starvation were immediate. He experienced frequent dizzy spells, lost coordination, and collapsed multiple times during choreography practices. His bandmates, recognizing the danger, tried to persuade him to eat, but his perfectionism and deep-seated insecurity over his appearance overrode their concerns. He lost significant weight, achieving the hollow, sharp facial structure he desired, but at the cost of chronic fatigue, muscle depletion, and a severe strain on his cardiovascular system. This period of self-imposed starvation coincided with the creation of his solo track, Lie, a song whose lyrics directly address his feelings of being caught in a trap of his own making, unable to escape the demands of a perfectionist persona. The physical sacrifices did not stop with dieting. Jimin was routinely assigned the most physically demanding and high-risk segments of the group's choreographies due to his flexibility and athletic capability.
In their early track, We Are Bulletproof Part 2, he had to perform an acrobatic backflip over J-Hope, a move that carried a high risk of head and spinal injury if executed incorrectly on the slippery stage floors of live television broadcasts. The toll of executing these high-impact moves, combined with chronic undernourishment and sleep deprivation, resulted in persistent joint pain, muscle cares, and back issues that required constant medical intervention backstage during world tours. Despite his status as one of the world's most celebrated performers, the habit of harsh self-criticism and physical self-sacrifice remained a dominant theme in his career. In various documentary series, Jimin is shown criticizing his vocal pitch and dance execution even after flawless performances, demonstrating the psychological burden of a career built on the absolute denial of physical comfort. He sacrificed his classical career path, his physical well-being, and his own bodily safety to fit into a mold that was never designed for a contemporary dancer. The story of Park Jimin is a stark illustration of the intense physical and emotional cost of perfectionism, a reminder that the grace seen on stage is often bought with silent, agonizing battles against one's own limitations. And yet, while he starved his body and drained his energy to earn his place on stage, the leader of the group was quietly sacrificing the very thing that most artists guard above all else, his personal creative voice.
Number 1. The leader who surrendered his voice, RM. Kim Namjoon was born on September 12, 1994 in Ilsan, South Korea, and from an early age he demonstrated an intellectual capacity that set him far apart from his peers. He possessed an IQ of 148 and scored in the top 1% of the nation in the college entrance examinations for language, mathematics, foreign language, and social studies. With these academic credentials, Namjoon was on a trajectory towards South Korea's elite Sky universities, a path that would have guaranteed him a position of immense prestige, influence, and financial security in Korean society. Ilsan, where Namjoon was raised, is known for its highly competitive educational systems. In this environment, a student's worth is measured by mock examination scores and prospective placement in elite institutions. For Namjoon, scoring in the top 1% was not just a personal achievement, it was a societal passport to a predetermined class of Korean professionals, including doctors, lawyers, or senior government administrators. By walking away from this structure, he wasn't just choosing a creative hobby, he was actively rejecting the collective expectations of his teachers, his extended family, and the social institutions that had earmarked him for a conventional high-status career. His mother, recognizing his academic potential, strongly opposed his interest in hip-hop, confiscating his computer and microphone to force him to focus on his schoolwork. The domestic conflict reached a turning point when Namjoon asked his mother a single, decisive question. Did she want a son who was first in the nation academically, but miserable, or a son who was ranked 5,000th, but doing what he loved? Reluctantly, his parents allowed him to pursue music, and he began performing in the underground hip-hop scene under the moniker Runch Randa. In the underground, he built a rapid reputation as a lyricist of exceptional depth, collaborating with other rising underground figures like Woo Ji-ho, who would later become Zico. This underground community was built on a code of raw authenticity, where commercial success was viewed with suspicion and artistic purity was the ultimate currency. His music during this era was raw and deeply personal, recorded in basic home setups and shared on community forums. In 2010, Namjoon became the first member recruited for Big Hit Entertainment's new group, a decision that required him to step away from the underground and enter the world of idol training. This transition cost him the respect of the underground hip-hop community, which immediately labeled him a sellout for choosing to wear stage makeup, perform synchronized choreographies, and work within the commercial K-pop system. The hostility reached a public climax during a broadcast in 2013, shortly after BTS's debut, when the underground rapper Be Free publicly insulted Namjoon and Suga, mocking their decision to become idols, questioning their masculinity, and claiming that their music was not real hip-hop. Namjoon had to sit in silence and endure this public humiliation, representing a company that was too small to protect him from such industry attacks. The choice to become an idol meant sacrificing the creative freedom he had enjoyed as an underground artist. As he now had to conform his complex, dense lyrical styles to fit the structural and thematic limitations of commercial pop music. As the group's leader, Namjoon carried an additional silent burden that none of the other members had to bear. He was the bridge between the agency's management and the members, responsible for communicating administrative decisions to his teammates and representing the group's concerns to the executives. This role required him to put aside his own personal grievances and stress to manage the group's internal harmony, mediating conflicts and maintaining morale in a high-pressure environment where failure meant the financial collapse of their agency. The depth of this commitment was tested in a documented hidden camera prank orchestrated by Big Hit's founder Bang Si-hyuk in 2014. Bang Si-hyuk called Namjoon into a room and criticized his leadership, accusing him of holding the group back and demanding to know if he wanted to pursue a solo career or remain with BTS. Without a single second of hesitation, Namjoon answered that he wanted BTS, sacrificing his immediate personal ambition for the collective future of the group. When BTS transitioned to a global act, Namjoon's role as leader took on a geopolitical weight. As the only member of the group who was fluent in English, having taught himself by watching the sitcom Friends, he became the sole translator, spokesperson, and public representative for BTS during their international promotions. During appearances on highly watched American talk shows like The Ellen DeGeneres Show and The Late Late Show with James Corden, Namjoon had to sit in the center seat, acting as both a performer and a working translator. While dealing with his own performance anxiety on live television, he had to translate host questions, explain them to his teammates, and translate their Korean responses back into fluent English. He had to perform this complex cognitive task under the glare of studio lights and the gaze of millions of viewers, knowing that a single misstatement or mistranslation could lead to a misinterpretation, offense, or mockery of his bandmates. The pressure of knowing that a single misstatement or mistranslation could spark a national controversy or damage the group's international reputation was an immense intellectual and emotional burden. This dynamic peaked in 2018 when BTS was invited to speak at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, where Namjoon delivered a 6-minute speech on self-acceptance and youth empowerment, speaking before world leaders on behalf of his generation. While the moment was celebrated globally as a historic achievement, the preparation for the event was a period of intense anxiety for Namjoon, who spent nights refining every word to ensure it carried the appropriate diplomatic weight. The intellectual genius who could have easily navigated a prestigious academic life chose instead to place the weights of 7 lives, a struggling company, and a global fandom on his shoulders. He sacrificed his academic safety, his underground reputation, and his own creative autonomy to construct the foundation upon which BTS could stand. The legacy of Kim Namjoon is a study in leadership defined by personal surrender, showing that the true measure of a leader is not the height of their own platform, but the strength of the foundation they build for others. And that is the final piece of the puzzle: 7 separate sacrifices that built one historic dynasty.